Hi there, my name's Brendan Malone. I've been asked to record this brief little presentation for you on this profoundly important question. If there is a God, why is there suffering and evil in the world? And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to attempt to give in as brief a time as I possibly can a robust Christian answer to that question. What is the Christian theological and philosophical answer to that question of if there's a God, why is there suffering and evil in the world? Basically, people who would make this argument tend to be more convinced in their atheism, and what they would say is the fact that there is suffering and evil in the world means that there's only really one of three options that we have to choose from. Number one, that God can't actually stop suffering and evil. So he's not all-powerful, therefore he's not really a God. The second option is that the fact that there's suffering and evil in the world means that God doesn't care about us. He doesn't care about suffering and evil. He doesn't do anything to stop it because he's quite happy to see us experience suffering and to be the victims of evil. So that kind of God is basically evil and not worthy of our worship or time. And number three is the idea that if there's suffering and evil in the world, that must mean that there is no God. The reason suffering and evil keeps happening is because there is no God to actually do anything about it, to intervene and to prevent that from happening. And this is usually presented as a very strong and robust sort of atheistic answer in response to Christianity. However, I would say that this response is missing one vitally important fourth option here, that there is a God. He doesn't want us to suffer, but he allows suffering to happen. He allows evil in order to protect other important goods that need to exist in the world for our human flourishing, our human well-being. So if we think about the example that is terrorizing the world right now, if you like, and that's the issue of coronavirus. Microbes can harm, and we are seeing right now the proof of that playing out around the globe. But they also provide many important benefits as well. It's not all one-way traffic. Another example is the Christchurch earthquake, where a lot of people died very quickly as a direct result of that February earthquake. But the thing is, a world without earthquakes would be a world without plate tectonics. It would be a world that would effectively be, and this is a very basic and crude way of describing it, but it would be a smooth marble with no differential in terrain at all, and the world would be entirely covered in a layer of water. And it would be a place that we couldn't actually inhabit. So you see, just in that sort of basic natural level, there are trade-offs here, if you like. Not everything that necessarily has a bad consequence or can cause bad things to happen in the world is inherently bad in and of itself. It can also be the cause of a lot of good and important benefits in the world too. But there's an even bigger and more profound good that needs to be protected, and that is the good of human free will. And here's the important point. If God removed all suffering from the world, that would mean that we would instantly lose our free will. We could not actually make any decision. We could never choose to do anything that would ever cause harm to ourselves or harm to another person, whether that is some sort of direct evil or whether that is just a bad, imprudent decision or something dumb that we do that actually puts us in harm's way, or even, for example, playing our favorite sport, which always entails some form of risk. You could never choose to do that because of the possibility that that would result in suffering in your life. So our free will would be lost. We could never choose to do anything that would lead to some form of suffering. And that obviously raises an important question. Well, at what point would God intervene and what level of suffering would be considered tolerable? Because as soon as you removed all the big suffering from the world, all of a sudden that's gone from our radar. That's no longer the big suffering. Instead, what you might say, the medium level of suffering we experience in our lives, that would now be considered catastrophic and large. So obviously that would have to go as well. And then once that's gone, then we'd say, well, even the small sufferings we experience in life, they would now be catastrophic too. So even the sense of, I don't know, the struggle that some of us have to get out of bed in the morning, or the fact that we wake up and we just feel so groggy and tired, and or at the end of the day we experience the suffering of a tired body that doesn't want to sleep. Those very small, minute kind of sufferings would now be the top level of suffering, and in theory they would have to go as well. So all of a sudden, quickly, you see how this one thing is not quite as simple as it first appears, and there is a complex weave and a complex sort of interplay in the way in which suffering is experienced by us and impacts our daily life. And the important reality of that is that suffering is a byproduct of our ability to actually have free will. So think about the Christchurch earthquake. That Christchurch earthquake, the reason that people died on that day was because a whole lot of free will decisions were made, and not just recent ones either. Decisions that spanned decades, generations were made. The decision, for example, of the first settlers who arrived in Christchurch and made the free will decision that this is where they were going to build their city. That was a free will decision. Surely, if we were going to remove all suffering from the world, and all risk of suffering as well would have to go too, then God would have to say, I'm sorry, you can't choose to put your city there. They would have to be prevented from making any decision at all that could cause suffering right here and right now, or even into the future for other people. On the day itself, people made decisions, free will decisions, to get on buses, to go into town. The tourists who came here and very tragically lost their lives. All of those things were preceded by free will decisions. And if you take away suffering and evil, all of a sudden we can never choose anything that could lead to suffering. We could never choose anything other than to do the good. And what that would mean is that we could never actually choose. We would never have free will. So in order to protect the good of human free will, God has to allow suffering and evil to exist in the world. This is really important because this ultimately goes to the big question of why we even really need free will. And one of the most important reasons why we need free will is because of our capacity to love. For love to be authentic love, it has to be freely chosen. If you force someone to love you, they are not loving you. That is not a loving act, to be forced to actually love another person. Love has to be freely chosen on the part of the person who does the loving. But if we have no free will, we would not be able to actually freely choose to love another. And we would not also be freely able to choose to love God. We would have to love God, and that wouldn't be love. Because loving God, a God who is all-powerful and has our best interests at heart, that would be the only sane and logical thing to do. It would be the most important decision that we could make for our human flourishing and for our own benefit and for the benefit of the whole world, everyone choosing to love God and to do as he calls us to do. And so therefore, to do anything else would be evil, and we would have no free will and would have no say in the matter. We would be forced. But the problem is that would no longer be a relationship of love. We would no longer be free. We would be zombies. We would be automatons who were doing something that we were programmed to do and nothing more. But because God is a loving God, as Christian theology tells us, he has to allow us the freedom to actually choose. Because just like a human relationship, if you truly love someone, you will actually give them the freedom to make that choice to love you in return. You are not loving them if you force them to remain in a relationship with you that they don't want to be in, or that they have not chosen. So you trick them or you brainwash them in some way. That is not a loving act that respects the dignity of the other person. But for Christianity, God is a loving God. And this is the really important thing too, just to wrap this all up. When confronted with the problem of suffering and evil in the world, Christianity actually has a really important response to make to that. Christianity says that when you grieve because you experience suffering, when you grieve because you are the victim of evil, so someone victimizes you and you experience grief about that, or you lose a relative or a family member or someone you love to perhaps death or disease, and you grieve that loss, Christianity says your grief is profoundly important, and it's a really important sign, and it's a really important moment of truth, in fact, because your grief points to the fact that it's not supposed to be this way. Grief only makes sense. To be sad about something only really makes sense if it could have been another way. So to grieve the loss of a child from cancer only really makes sense if it is not good for young children to die prematurely of cancer. If that's a form of suffering and evil, if you like. Our grief is a recognition that it's not meant to be that way and that it could have been another way. And Christianity says, you're right. That's the way that we are supposed to approach suffering and evil. We're supposed to grieve and show solidarity with those who experience suffering and grief in their lives. Why? Because Christianity says that the world wasn't created evil. It was created good. But then mankind made a decision and the corruption of sin entered the world, and with it came suffering and evil. And so when we grieve those things, we are saying it's not supposed to be this way, the world shouldn't be this way. And Christianity says, you're right, it shouldn't actually be this way, because the world was created to be different. And when we grieve, that makes sense. But atheism doesn't really have a coherent answer, I would suggest, certainly not a deep one, to that question of why grief makes sense. Because if there is no God, and the world wasn't meant to be any other way than the way it is, just some sort of awful Darwinian survival of the fittest with lots of suffering and death and grief, then guess what? Grieving over the loss of someone, or grieving because you've been victimized, it's pointless. It doesn't make any sense. The world wasn't meant to be any other way, according to the belief that there is no God and there is no plan and there is no better way for things to be. I've gone a few minutes longer than I wanted to, but hopefully this brief little presentation has given you a good little insight into why suffering and evil, the existence of suffering and evil in the world, is not actually the major problem for Christianity and for Christian belief and belief in a God that some people would try and make it out to be. Thanks for watching.